This is a special production of ABC News.
It was a hard time, of course, but now all is over and we are all very, very happy.
Magyar Köztársaság!
I want to see everybody who is here to be free, to think what he wants, to say what he thinks.
O popolului și națiunii noastre independente.
A nimănui și ceea ce arată cât de falsă.
Şoförümüz bu birlikte 1 milyonlar üzerimize geleni ele... İstifa! İstifa!
This is the fall of communism. Here now, Pierre Salinger.
Hello, I'm Pierre Salinger, and we have quite a story to tell. It's a story of a rise so dramatic and a collapse so sudden that it really could be the stuff of fiction. But it isn't. It is fact. It is a fact that has dominated our lives for almost all of this century and will dominate our lives and those of our children and grandchildren as we and they move into the next century. It's a story of world communism, more specifically Soviet and Western communism. It was born in violent revolution in the Soviet Union in the second decade of this century. It spread from Moscow and the Bolshevik uprising to dominate much of the world for much of the 20th century. From an idea to force, to world power, and nearly world domination in 70 years. Out of it grew the Cold War, the arms race, and fears of nuclear Armageddon. Within a matter of months, 6 to be exact, Western communism all but collapsed. Freedom and forms of democracy swept across what we once called the East Bloc. We watched what happened with suddenness that was stunning. And we are continuing to watch changes inside the Soviet Union that many in the West had hoped for, but few really believed they would see. All of this change has taken place so quickly that it has, when you think about it, outdated every textbook in every country around the world. So think of what follows as not just history and current events, but also as a video textbook. It is a learning lesson about what the world was, how it has changed, and what it might become because of the change. Let me begin. At the beginning, it is the turn of the century. The Tsars rule a European and Asian empire of immense proportions. This is where my colleague Barry Dunsmore picks up the story, because we cannot understand the present or guess successfully about the future without a very firm grasp on the past. Listen carefully, because throughout this report, you'll hear hints of things to come. Barry?
The beginning of the 20th century found Imperial Russia in deep trouble. Tsar Nicholas II faced problems that would plague Russia almost until the next century. At war with Japan, the Tsar was also fighting unrest within an empire whose boundaries had expanded beyond the limits of control. In January of 1905, that unrest focused on the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg. 30,000 workers massed to present a petition demanding political and social reforms. They were asking for a voice in the government, religious freedom, and an easing of the stranglehold the privileged had on the masses. What they got was an order from Cossack guards to disperse, followed by a massacre that left more than 1,000 dead. It was Red Sunday, the beginning of the end for the Tsar. He tried appeasement, creating a national assembly of elected members called the Duma. Its function, however, was to consult rather than to legislate, and that powerlessness led to its rejection by revolutionary dissidents. The intellectual inspiration for these dissidents was this man, the German philosopher Karl Marx, author of the Communist Manifesto. The most radical of the dissidents called themselves Bolsheviks, or majority people. Their majority was only 4 votes on a single issue debated in 1903, but the distinction of being known as Bolshevik, or majority, rather than Menshevik, or minority, was a great psychological advantage. These predominantly young revolutionaries found a receptive audience among people who watched their leaders indulge in excess while they struggled to feed themselves. Against this backdrop, Russia found herself embroiled in World War I, fighting against the German alliance. In 1917, after 3 years of war, the people and the army revolt. Strikes and demonstrations sweep Moscow, St. Petersburg, now called Petrograd, and other major population centers. The army refuses to continue fighting. Delegations from Great Britain and France, fearing the loss of Russian troops from the battle against the Germans, ask the Tsar to form a new government, one more acceptable to the people. He refuses. Then the National Assembly, or Duma, calls on Nicholas to change the government. When he again refuses, the leader of the Duma creates his own alliance of the wealthy, liberals, socialists, and the army, forming a provisional government to run the country. Left powerless, the Tsar abdicates, naming his brother, the Grand Duke Mikhail, to succeed him. But with no guarantee of safety, Mikhail renounces the throne after just 1 day. It is the end of Tsarist Russia. Into this vacuum of leadership, the Bolshevik revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Lenin returns from exile in Switzerland. He is quickly followed by Joseph Stalin, who had been banished to Siberia by the Tsar, and Leon Trotsky, who had been in America. Under the slogans, "All power to the Soviets," and "Bread, Land, and Peace," the Bolsheviks call for an end to the provisional government and for a transfer of power to the Soviets, the elected workers' councils. For the next 6 months, there is near anarchy as power shifts from the Bolsheviks to the moderates and back. The revolution comes on November 7th, 1917. Before dawn, the Red Guard, under the command of Leon Trotsky, enters Petrograd. By that evening, they have seized the ministries, the banks, the train stations, and the Winter Palace. Moscow falls 10 days later. The Soviet state is declared under the direction of a council of commissars of the people. Trotsky condemns the moderates to the ash cans of history. But the people still don't trust the Bolsheviks. On December 8th, a nationwide election of the assembly is won by the moderates. Despite overwhelming victories in Moscow and Petrograd, the Bolsheviks receive only 9 million of 36 million votes cast. Lenin refuses to cede power. In January of 1918, he dissolves the assembly by force and, with the World War still raging, moves to negotiate a separate peace treaty with the Germans. He signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Its terms are draconian. Russia must surrender all claim over Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which have already declared their independence, to the Germans. Russia is forced to retreat from Finland. Germany is given dominance over Poland and the Ukraine. Faced with a weakened Russia, Soviet Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan joined the Baltic states in declaring their independence. Past history with a ring of the present.
World War I was over for Russia, but the cost was enormous. All told, the Russians lost 34% of their population, 32% of their arable land, 54% of their industrial capacity, and 86% of their oil production capacity. It was the first loss of territory in nearly 4 centuries, reducing Russia to its borders of the late 17th century. It was a loss that Soviet leaders, Stalin in particular, never forgot. By the end of 1917, the capital was moved from Petrograd to Moscow, and the Bolshevik Party was now the Communist Party. But Lenin's revolution was in trouble.
The Germans, Turks, Tartars, and Cossacks are actively in opposition. Czech legions, which once fought for the Tsar, refused to disarm and seized the Trans-Siberian Railway. The British and Japanese controlled the major ports. A coalition of social democrats and social revolutionaries form a counter-government and seize the country's entire gold reserve. Now Russia finds herself torn by civil war. The Red Army of the Bolsheviks pitted against the combined White Army of the Provisional Government. The Tsar and his family are secretly executed by the Bolsheviks in July of 1918. A month later, it is Lenin who is wounded in an assassination attempt, and the Bolsheviks declare the start of a campaign of terror determined to recoup their losses. World War I ends on November 11, 1918. By October of 1919, the Red Army retakes Petrograd, Moscow, and the Urals. White Army commander Admiral Kolchak is captured and executed, and the Civil War, for the most part, is over. But Russia is in shambles. The World War claimed nearly 2 million lives. The Civil War, hundreds of thousands more. The physical and human resources used to fight the wars have left factories and farms idle. Announcing a plan that will be repeated by future leaders, Lenin reveals his new economic policy in 1921. It is a partial return to capitalism in an attempt to encourage production. But a disastrous harvest leaves the nation racked by famine, incapable of carrying out Lenin's plans. Official Russian estimates put the number of hunger-stricken at 33 million.
The League of Nations blamed the famine on Soviet political and social policies, saying no system could flourish in which individual thought or action was discouraged and dissent was met by brutality. Between 1920 and 1922, the Red Army reconquered the Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And on December 30th, 1922, Russia declared herself to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, though no less unified a republic had ever existed. But as contentious as the individual republics of the Union might have been, this paled when compared to the splits in its leadership.
In 1923, Lenin calls for Stalin's ouster, saying he is too brutal. But Lenin dies in January of 1924, and Stalin becomes one of a 3-man troika ruling the Soviet Union. In the next 10 years, Stalin consolidates his power and disposes of his competition. The troika is dissolved. In December of 1934, the secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party is assassinated. Labeling the assassination a Trotskyite plot, Stalin begins a series of purges to eliminate the last vestiges of opposition to his authority. 3 major show trials are held between August of 1936 and March of 1938, in which being charged is tantamount to being guilty. Men who were powerful one day are executed the next. In all, thousands of Stalin's alleged opponents are condemned to death in the purges. At the same time, millions of peasants die as Stalin forces the collectivization of farming. Stalin's power is secure, but the nation is paralyzed by the loss of so many. In Germany, Adolf Hitler has also secured his power, and with Italy and Japan, now threatens all of Western and Eastern Europe. The Soviets discuss a military alliance with France and Britain, but neither country really trusts Stalin, and the negotiations stall. So in August of 1939, Stalin signs a non-aggression pact with Germany, and in September, together they invade Poland. In a secret clause of that pact, Nazi Germany cedes the Baltic states back to Russia, and in June of 1940, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk long ago annulled, the Soviets invade Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Their short-lived independence from Russian domination had lasted only 22 years. Then in June of 1941, it is Russia which is invaded. Hitler has decided the communists represent a threat which must be eradicated. His attack takes the Soviets by surprise. Stalingrad is taken. Moscow itself is threatened. It takes more than 2 years of bitter fighting before the Russians repel the invaders. The human toll of the war is enormous. More than 20 million Russians are killed. But by its end, Stalin has retaken all of Russia's 20th century territorial losses and then some. In November at Tehran, Stalin meets with Roosevelt and Churchill. The conferees agree to let Russia keep the Baltic states. They divide Poland, giving domination to the Soviets. In late 1944, Churchill meets Stalin in Moscow, and they divide Europe into spheres of influence. Russia is given most of Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, and half of Yugoslavia. This division is ratified 4 months later when the Allies meet on February 4th in Yalta. In return for the further territorial concessions of Soviet Georgia and the Ukraine, Russia agrees to the creation of the United Nations and commits itself to join in the fight against the Japanese. Finally, in April of 1945, Allied troops advancing from the west meet Soviet troops advancing from the east. Germany is defeated. The Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 shapes the world for the next 44 years. Germany loses 25% of its territory and is divided, ceding control to Russia, France, Britain, and the United States. Stalin demands and gets formal title to parts of Poland, Azerbaijan, as well as Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. The Soviet Union is now established as one of the great world powers, its territory and influence now larger than at any time in its history. But suspicion of the communists, their means and motives runs deep. In 1946, Winston Churchill warns the Allies about Russia's appetite for domination.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
And behind that iron curtain, Stalin goes on consolidating Soviet power. October of 1946, the communists take the government in Bulgaria. February of 1948, Czechoslovakia. In June of 48, the Russians blockade Berlin. Only a massive Allied airlift prevents the entire city from falling to the communists. March 5th, 1953. Joseph Stalin dies, but his empire survives. After a brief power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev is named Premier Secretary of the Communist Party. In May of 1955, the Warsaw Pact is formed. Under Russian direction, Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia are joined in a union of mutual defense designed to rival the West's North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In February of 1956, Khrushchev proposes a relaxation of control within the East Bloc nations. Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia see this speech as an invitation to regain some autonomy and pull away from the Soviet Union. Nothing could be further from the truth. On October 23, 1956, the Hungarians are in open revolt against Soviet domination, demanding free elections, announcing Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. On November 4th, Soviet tanks crush that revolution. Its leaders are killed or imprisoned, and a new government, one totally subservient to Moscow, is installed. In 1961, the Soviets begin construction of the Berlin Wall, splitting the East from the West, daring NATO and the United States to respond. They go unchallenged. But in 1962, Russia puts medium-range missiles in Cuba. It is a serious misjudgment. American warships blockade Cuban harbors, going nose-to-nose with the Soviets. This time, nearly at the brink of war, it is the Soviets who back down. And by 1964, Khrushchev is deposed, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. In 1968, seeking political and social reform, Czechoslovakia leads another move away from the Russians. Poland is affected as well, swept by demonstrations for freedom and fundamental rights. It is the Prague Spring. It lasts until August. On the 20th, Soviet tanks and Warsaw Pact troops sweep into Czechoslovakia, and independence again succumbs to force. Now the Soviet Union declares itself to have limited sovereignty over its satellites, the right to protect the purity of communism against the contamination of capitalism by whatever means they deem appropriate. The Soviets are eager to spread this sovereignty outside their immediate boundaries as well. The African nations of Ethiopia, Somalia, Angola, Egypt, and Libya become client states. Syria and Iraq are taken under the communist wing, and in Asia, North Korea and North Vietnam. In 1976, Nicolae Ceausescu swears Romania's allegiance to the precepts of the party. Yugoslavia's leader does the same. Then, in 1979, the Russians invade Afghanistan, allegedly at the request of the Communist Party there. The resulting guerrilla war takes resources Russia can ill afford. The Soviet Union is already short of food and consumer goods. The shortages are exacerbated by the need to provide far-flung client states with goods and support. The government is rocked by a series of deaths. Brezhnev in 1982, then Andropov in 84, and Chernenko in 85. Finally, it is Mikhail Gorbachev who inherits a country made destitute by 4 decades of committing virtually all of its financial and intellectual resources to military competition with the United States. A country with a failing domestic economy and rising internal and external dissent. It is clear that the old policies are not and have not been working. Gorbachev declares the need for change. He orders a withdrawal from Afghanistan. He announces new policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, the restructuring of all facets of Soviet life. The results of these declarations and the actions, or lack thereof, that followed, rewrote history. Pierre?
Glasnost and perestroika. Openness and restructuring. Together they would bring change, but they would bring it far more swiftly and create more danger than any would have believed, especially Mr. Gorbachev. Those winds of change swept out of the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe like a hurricane. The proverbial genie was out of the bottle. And the monolith the Soviet Union had built in the 40 years following World War II trembled, then tottered, and finally fell. The reverberations from that crash are still being felt and will be felt for years to come. What happened? Watch as ABC News covered the most dynamic story of the century. 6 months that shook the world.
It is immensely important to Poles that an American president has come to identify with their political and economic struggle. Mr. Bush is the first American president to come to the Soviet Union's unpredictable backyard in more than a decade. And he has a chance to affect the course of history here as Poles make a difficult and dangerous transition to democracy.
George Bush was met with a standing ovation today in the Polish parliament, where an American president just a few years ago would not have been invited, let alone applauded. They even sang to him. May you live 100 years, the old song goes. The president had come to applaud the political reform that has occurred here and to coax this debt-burdened nation toward a free market economy. He didn't say it would be easy.
And I must speak honestly. Economic reform and recovery cannot occur without sacrifices. Given the enormity of this moment, the United States stands ready to help as you help yourselves.
The president said he would ask Congress for a $100 million fund to aid free enterprise in Poland, would ask the World Bank to approve $325 million in new loans, and ask his fellow Western leaders to defer Polish debt payments on about $5 billion this year. That was less than some in Poland had hoped for, but there was no mistaking the president's sentiments.
Long live Poland. Long live Poland. Thank you very, very much.
The most important response came in an exclusive interview granted to ABC News by the Polish leader, General Jaruzelski. General Jaruzelski revealed he had consulted with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev today, and that President Bush's visit had been positive for Polish-Soviet relations as well as U.S.-Soviet relations.
And it's very heartening that the leaders of the two big powers are guided by the same intentions. And I feel that this bodes well for the future.
When President Bush arrived here in Budapest tonight, he came to another country in the Soviet bloc, which is moving vigorously in the direction of democracy. Hungarians, like Poles, have high expectations of Mr. Bush and a very clear need for U.S. support. Here at the very center of Europe, with the Soviets and an unfriendly Romania to the east, unfriendly Czechoslovakia to the north, and a virtually open border to the west, Hungarians are also trying to find the right balance between political and economic reform.
The president took his campaign for change in the communist world to a university named for Karl Marx, the father of communism. A sign of change already made is that Marx's bronze statue was out of sight behind a camera platform as the president spoke of the new Hungary.
And this is partly possible because brave men and women have formed opposition parties, and this is possible because Hungarian leaders are going to show the ultimate political courage, the courage to submit to the choice of the people in free elections.
As a reward and incentive for reform, the president announced a modest economic program for Hungary, including a $25 million U.S. fund for free enterprise, favored treatment for Hungary in trade with the U.S., and encouragement for U.S. industry to invest here.
25 million for boosting private business, it's really almost peanuts.
Hungarians are much more cautious about the United States than Poles are. Hungarians who lived through revolution and Soviet repression in 1956 have a deeply rooted belief that they were abandoned by the United States. And so they will be genuinely impressed by America's material investment in their future and less affected than Poles by the rhetoric of freedom. For many weeks now, we've been hearing about and even seeing how the Iron Curtain is coming down between Hungary here in the Soviet bloc and Austria just to the west. Hungarian soldiers have been rolling up the dreaded barbed wire, which has helped to keep millions of people captive on this side of it for so long. This morning, the Hungarian Prime Minister gave President Bush a small piece of barbed wire, an expression, he said, of our hope that Europe will not be divided much longer. You know what they're going to do with the rest of it? They're going to sell it. No, not as scrap metal, as souvenirs. One of those joint ventures the president has been advocating between a Hungarian company and an Austrian one. In western Siberia, a miners' strike has paralyzed the nation's second-largest coal field. It touches on all the issues which hamper Soviet development, and the miners have ignored an appeal for Mr. Gorbachev to get back on the job.
It is the most serious strike to hit the Soviet Union since Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. The workers' demands focused on issues like better housing and better protection for miners. There are no safety measures, says this striker. Faced with economic disruption, the government granted many of those demands. But now the strike has broadened into a political protest against Moscow's centralized control of the mining industry. There's no indication the strike is winding down. In fact, on the Soviet evening news tonight, it was reported that the strike has now spread to the nation's leading coal mining region in the Ukraine.
Sometimes the pressures for change in the Soviet Union disrupt life violently. Today, Soviet Army units patrolled the Black Sea resort city of Sukhumi, where over the weekend at least 14 people were killed when rival ethnic groups fought over admission policies at a local university. Soviet officials say they seized more than 1,000 weapons from what they call roving gangs of bandits. Soviet troops have now imposed a curfew. Pravda today reported that at a meeting of party leaders called to discuss the miners' strike and the ethnic violence in Soviet Georgia, Mr. Gorbachev demanded another party purge, saying that opponents of reform must be replaced if perestroika or restructuring is going to succeed.
The miners are fed up with the coal mining bureaucracy centered in Moscow and their local mine directors, all of whom they say have been interested only in coal production, not miners' needs. The depth of that feeling was apparent during a tour the strikers gave us of their mine. With the mine director away, our guides enjoyed pointing out the contrast between their lives and the elite. They showed us one of the director's private offices. Look, you can even turn on a color television here, says this miner. And then a quick look at the director's private sauna. Now this is privilege, said one miner. They're oppressing us, and we're the working class.
There's new ethnic unrest in the Soviet republics of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Communist Party officials met in Azerbaijan today with opposition leaders trying to avert a general strike called for next month. The dispute centers on ethnic tensions in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is on the border with Armenia.
A blood feud is being waged over Nagorno-Karabakh, where Christian Armenians outnumber Muslim Azerbaijanis by 4-1. By Kremlin decree, the region was taken from Armenia in 1923 and placed under Azerbaijani control. Armenians want it back. We have one history, one destiny, says this man. Nagorno-Karabakh is like a child stolen from its mother. There can be no compromise. Azerbaijanis won't compromise either. When we visited a wedding ceremony in this Azerbaijani village, the mood turned angry when people were asked about Armenian demands. We'll never give up this land, this man says. They've burned our homes, adds this woman. How can we live with Armenians now? 5,000 Interior Ministry troops have been dispatched to the region to prevent further bloodshed. Bivouac troops sharpen their skills during the day. Fearful of road attacks, trucks carrying needed supplies travel in convoys, protected by the military. A year and a half ago, says this Armenian activist, we thought Gorbachev would help. Now we know we must settle this issue ourselves. But with both sides saying they can't live with the other, the best Moscow can do for now is to make certain they stay apart.
Poland's move toward a government in which communists are a minority and the growing unrest in the Baltic states are merely two signs of the unprecedented changes taking place in Eastern Europe.
What would Lenin, the father of world communism, think, seeing the movement he inspired begin to crumble from within? What would Joseph Stalin do if he were to see his Iron Curtain across Europe torn down? And what will it mean for their successors if Poland forms a non-communist government?
This is the end of the communist system in Europe. It's 100% certain. I'm positive about it.
Eastern Europe, once a solid bloc controlled by Moscow. Today, it's more like a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces come from 3 different boxes. There are Hungary and Poland on the verge of forming multi-party systems. Czechoslovakia and East Germany, where dissent surfaces despite government attempts to keep it down. Only in Romania and Bulgaria, still living in the twilight of Stalinism, is there no significant dissent at all.
I think we are moving towards something that's never been seen before. That is to say, we've seen transitions from authoritarian right-wing regimes to liberal democracies. We've never seen such a transition take place in a communist system.
The question is, how far will it go? Will the ever-increasing flow of refugees from East Germany prompt that government to relax its grip? And what about Czechoslovakia? Will the roots of Prague Spring 1968 send up new shoots? Or will they be stomped down, as they have been this week?
In Czechoslovakia, in the short run, I think we can expect repression, and in the long run, I think that the regime cannot last, and we are going to see a reformist communist regime emerge in Czechoslovakia in the next 5 years.
Soviet President Gorbachev, who has his own troubles in places like the Baltics, has said Eastern Bloc allies are free to plan their own systems as long as they remain loyal to the Warsaw Military Alliance.
His opponents fear this will only encourage more dissent, disagreements among countries of Eastern Europe, and weaken Moscow's control of the alliance.
This policy does have risks for Mr. Gorbachev because his hardline opponents can say, look what you've done. This demonstrates that as soon as you relax the brakes, the system becomes unmanageable.
But the system, many say, was already unmanageable, unable to provide basic necessities.
I think that this has to be seen as a crisis of the whole communist world.
For the first time in the history of the Soviet bloc, the government of one country in Eastern Europe has actively helped the citizens of another to escape. From East Germany to Hungary, through Austria, and then on to West Germany.
East Germans crowded around a television set up in a refugee camp here in Budapest. They were about to hear the announcement of their lives. You can see the anticipation in their faces. Most were leaving behind everything, their homes, their jobs, some even their families, for a new life in the West. But before the announcement, they didn't know if they'd be allowed to go. The Hungarian foreign minister assured them they could, with a few short words. The border would be open to them at midnight. As the applause died down, they heard the foreign minister explain this was a unilateral decision on Hungary's part. No deal was made with either East or West Germany. In a bit of political tightrope walking, he said Hungary does not want to get involved in a dispute between the two Germanys. The refugees were free to leave, he said. Where they go is up to them. By making this decision, Hungary may have solved what for the reform-minded government has been a ticklish diplomatic problem: how to honor old loyalties with its eastern neighbors while adhering to democratic principles of the West. The refugees created an uncomfortable situation for the Hungarian government.
Over the years, many people have been shot and killed in trying to climb the Berlin Wall and escape to the West. Now they're escaping to the West not by climbing the wall, but by going around it. 20 years ago, the Soviet Union would not have allowed this to happen. Well, this time, so far, they have made no move to stop it. This seems to show that once people believe that guns and tanks will not be turned against them, they will go after what they always want: freedom.
This is how people used to escape from East Germany. And this is how they did it this week. Some 13,000 East Germans walked or drove across the Hungarian border to freedom in the West. Even a few months ago, this would have been inconceivable. A communist country, Hungary, helping the citizens of another communist country escape. The Great Exodus started 4 months ago when Hungary began dismantling its barbed wire border with Austria as part of a program of political and economic reform to bring it closer to the West.
Freedom. We are free.
Jobs and liberty.
These are people who are 70% under 35 years old. They are all trained, they are technicians, they're engineers, they're just the type of people that the GDR cannot afford to lose.
The crisis dramatizes a growing rift in the communist bloc. Gorbachev has urged reform on his East European clients to gain time for their failing economies, but only two have taken him up on it: Hungary and Poland, which this week made history by installing the first non-communist government in its post-war history. But 4 other Soviet satellites have resisted the call for reform, and none more so than East Germany. This month marks the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, a war that ended up in redrawing the map of Europe. And the ugliest scar on that new map was the Berlin Wall, built by an East German regime that, unlike the other Soviet satellites, was wholly artificial, and now, under the leadership of hardliners like the ailing 77-year-old East German party boss Erich Honecker, has the most to lose from the changes sweeping the communist world.
The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in East Berlin today, a city shaken by massive defections, and mentioned the dreaded word: change. The Soviet leader wasted no time in telling the East German leadership that while everyone should decide for themselves what is necessary for their country, the real danger is when they don't react to life.
This is the worst breakdown of public order in this country since 1953, when Soviet tanks put down a workers' rebellion. Whatever happens next here, there will be no Soviet tanks. As Gorbachev said during his visit, this problem will have to be solved in Berlin, not in Moscow.
Time has finally run out for Erich Honecker, the 77-year-old leader of East Germany. Honecker resigned today, replaced by his hand-picked successor, Egon Krenz. The official reason given was poor health, but growing political unrest made today's change inevitable.
Only 2 weeks ago, Honecker staged a huge party to celebrate East Germany's 40th anniversary and told Mikhail Gorbachev that things were just fine. They were not. More than 50,000 East Germans had fled their homeland in recent weeks, and tens of thousands more demonstrated for political reforms. And so, for the first time, the people of East Germany have actually forced a change in their leadership, which means it's a brand new situation.
Take a look at East Germany tonight, and the overwhelming impression is this: the people have their government on the run. The facts are these. Today, in a bid to convince people that he's serious about reform, the East German leader, Egon Krenz, who's had the job for less than a month, managed to convince all the members of the government he inherited they should resign. The question is this: what next? Post-war order in Europe has changed. Millions of East Germans locked up for so long have a measure of freedom now that most of them had never imagined. The wall has suddenly become irrelevant, something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more, put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move.
It's now very clear that the Gorbachev visit to East Germany last month was not simply to attend an anniversary party. According to Soviet policymakers, Gorbachev knew his presence would affect the political mood here. It certainly did. Gorbachev became the symbol and the slogan of the masses who took to the streets. And it was these people who drove the old guard out and profoundly changed the country in just 4 weeks.
At the beginning of this year, Erich Honecker, who was responsible for actually building the wall, said that it would stand for 100 years. For weeks and months now, as we've reported on Eastern Europe, it has often seemed as if the domino effect was the dominant one. First Hungary and then Poland, and most recently East Germany. Change, change, and more change. Now the focus is on Czechoslovakia. Now hundreds of thousands of Czechoslovaks are in the streets.
They packed into Wenceslas Square. They jammed the side streets, and they were not just students and intellectuals. There were workers, too, and in large numbers. And in case the Communist Party and its government did not get the message from the mere sight of this many people, they drove it home with their chants. Resign, resign, they demanded. This protest movement may now be reaching a critical moment. A special session of the ruling Central Committee of the Communist Party meets tomorrow. It is empowered to make changes in the leadership. The most likely scapegoat is Milos Jakic, the party's general secretary. But the opposition group, the Civic Forum, wants at least 5 other Politburo members out. And the demonstrators are determined to throw them out, as they sang in their own version of a familiar American protest song.
Czechoslovakia's leading dissident told the crowds in Wenceslas Square today, "We will never return to the old system of totalitarian rule." Václav Havel is a playwright who has emerged as the central figure in the reform movement.
After years of struggle against the communist state, years of harassment, arrest, and imprisonment, Havel now believes they may be on the verge of victory. But the situation is still dangerous and unpredictable, Havel says. The protest movement is now too big to be controlled. Havel says the protest movement will settle for nothing less than the resignation of the hardline leadership of the communist government.
Czechoslovakia today became the latest of the countries of Eastern Europe, once held so tightly in the Soviet grip, to throw off its hardline communist yoke. Bowing to pressure from the growing pro-democracy demonstrations throughout the country, Communist Party boss Milos Jakic and all the other members of the Czech Communist Politburo resigned.
it was victory. It was perhaps only one battle in a non-violent war of liberation, but it was victory nonetheless, and they celebrated. The main opposition, the Civic Forum, got the word while holding a news conference. They popped open some champagne and toasted the news.
Long live free Czechoslovakia!
It was true people power that toppled the hardline communist leaders here, and it was surprisingly swift and easy. 5 days of demonstrations involving several 100,000 people in Wenceslas Square. And it was fitting that while the party leaders were deciding what to do, tonight's featured speaker at the demonstration was Alexander Dubček, whose own reform movement 21 years ago had been brutally crushed by Soviet-led tanks. Dubček na hrad, they chanted, Dubček to the castle. Prague Castle is the residence of the president. Now an aging, nostalgic symbol, Dubček from the balcony embraced the crowd. Despite today's astonishing events, the ouster of their hardline communist leaders, you could see as they sang the national anthem, the people realize there's still a long way to go.
So much has happened so fast here in Czechoslovakia. The assault on communist authority here has been much more sudden than it was in Hungary or Poland or in East Germany, and least expected. It is often said of Czechoslovaks that they are not easily stirred out of their complacency. After 40 years, the students here have done it in 10 days. Today, in the drive for democracy, the students are the shock troops. 20 years ago, their parents believed that the Communist Party could reform itself, and they were bullied into submission. Today, the young want an end to communist rule altogether. At every demonstration, the majority is always young. Here, it was the ringing of the keys. Thousands of Czechoslovaks shaking their house keys, their way of telling the Communist Party, the bell tolls for you. The sudden appearance of so many flags. In America, we fly the flag everywhere, but here, and it's the same in Hungary and Poland, the national colors are a symbol of defiance to communist rule. After all, the flag was here first. In Czechoslovakia these days, everyone on the right side of history is wearing a dash of their red, white, and blue. So much of what is happening here in Eastern Europe has been inspired by the Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev. Well, the highlight of Mr. Gorbachev's visit to Italy, without question, was his visit to the Pope. The first time ever that the leader of the Soviet Union had met with the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, and a son of Poland at that. It goes to show, said someone, that in this day and age, few things remain inconceivable for long.
This meeting ended 72 years of conflict between Moscow and the Vatican. When the two men emerged after an hour and a quarter of private talk, all the animosities seemed to have become history. Gorbachev announced that for the first time, formal diplomatic relations will be established between the Soviet Union and the Vatican. He said his government will soon adopt a new Soviet law for freedom of conscience, meaning freedom of religion for every person in the Soviet Union. He said he and John Paul even discussed a future visit of the Pope to the Soviet Union. No date was announced. John Paul will wait until the Soviets have followed through on their promise to legalize worship for the 7 million Catholics under Soviet rule. But the Pope did promise his support for Gorbachev's reforms.
In the run-up to the meeting here in Malta, a number of commentators at home and overseas have portrayed Mr. Gorbachev as the maker of history, and Mr. Bush as someone who takes advantage of opportunities created by others. Maybe so, but Mr. Bush is the one with all the advantages. Mr. Gorbachev's nation is up to its hammer and sickle in trouble.
During his trip to Eastern Europe this summer, the president was told by Poland's Lech Walesa that East Bloc reform depended on Gorbachev's success with perestroika, and that Bush should do more to help. Then, last month, with the breaching of the Berlin Wall, communism in East Germany, and now in Czechoslovakia, went into free fall. In the northern Soviet republics, there is the growing danger of secession. In the south, continuing ethnic violence and the threat of civil war. And everywhere, growing disillusionment with perestroika. This is why Gorbachev has been so eager to expand trade with the U.S. and for access to Western technology and affiliation with loan-granting international monetary institutions.
This summit, then, draws a curtain down on the last 3 decades of Cold War summitry, as the two superpowers now begin to grope their way toward a new, more cooperative relationship in a changed world.
The challenge facing Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union is to find a balance between precedent and the Communist Party's power. For some time now, he supported an end to the Communist Party's political monopoly in Eastern Europe, and yet he stands most determinedly against any such change at home.
In Moscow, several thousand people took part in a demonstration marking Human Rights Day. But that wasn't their only concern. Down with the party's monopoly of power, this man shouted. Get rid of Article 6, said this sign, referring to the provision in the Soviet Constitution which guarantees that monopoly. Across the city, another demonstration. This one sponsored by the Radical Democratic Union and without a permit from authorities. Signs read, Communism, the plague of the 20th century. Lenin, the father of the Soviet state, received this treatment. When the protesters refused to leave, the police moved in.
These growing threats to the power of the party are of concern in Moscow. Tomorrow, the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party will meet in special session. It is bound to consider that only yesterday Lithuania became the first Soviet republic to legalize a multi-party system.
After 2 days of debate, the Lithuanian parliament voted 243 to 1 to change the republic's constitution. They stripped the Communist Party of its monopoly of power in the republic and legalized a multi-party system. Several other republics, like Estonia, are moving in the same direction. Soviet citizens went to the polls in the Baltic republics of Estonia and Latvia, kicking off a new round of elections that could transform the Soviet Union from a one-party state to a multi-party system, whether they call it that or not. Communist Party candidates in the two republics are expected to get trounced by a grassroots movement known as the Popular Front.
In the last weeks and months, we've seen one Communist Party after the other in Eastern Europe knocked off its perch by the people. And it has been the speed of events which has astounded the West. Now in southeastern Europe, just above Greece and below Romania, where it shares the Black Sea with the Soviet Union, it is Bulgaria's turn.
As the day began, protesters gathered outside the Bulgarian Communist Party headquarters to urge speedy action on their demands for democratic reform during a policy-making session. Later, in a press conference, a party spokesman signaled the end of 45 years of communist rule with these words:
free and democratic elections to be held next year.
And it was announced that the communists have agreed to give up their constitutional guarantee of a monopoly on power.
Well, I'm saying that the party is ready to renounce itself.
Tonight, the red star of communism still dominates the skyline, but it no longer shines alone.
In Romania today, the most violent revolution in Eastern Europe so far. The people are fighting enormous odds to shake off the dictatorial leadership of Nicolae Ceausescu. As best we can tell, Ceausescu is either on the run or in custody, but his infamous security forces loyal to him have not given up.
Serious fighting begins in the early morning, a staccato of machine gun bursts punctuated by cannon fire. Street by street in some neighborhoods, the army is trying to clear areas infested by the security forces still loyal to deposed dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. The security men are outnumbered in some areas, so there were groups which surrendered. This sniper fell into the hands of an angry crowd and disappeared just as a single shot was fired. But the well-equipped security forces are reported to be holding some towns and sections of others. A massacre of an entire village is reported less than a mile from the airport.
The first indication that President Ceausescu had been overthrown came when Romanian dissidents suddenly appeared on the television screen. They had taken over the TV studio in Bucharest. This is, or was, state-controlled television that this week reported nothing of what was happening in Romania. Today, it reported everything. There were scenes of celebration. Romanians by the hundreds of thousands dancing, singing in Bucharest's Republic Square, waving flags with the despised socialist emblem ripped out. And from the western town of Timisoara, where the army reportedly massacred hundreds of people over the weekend, more celebration of Ceausescu's defeat and signs of just how much they hate him. Back at the television studio, Romanian army officers who just days ago ordered their men to open fire on unarmed civilians apologized. "I am so sorry," said one. "Children, old people, innocent victims have died. Find Ceausescu, arrest him. Do not kill him," said the officers. "We want to put him on trial." Ceausescu was on the run. Ceausescu, a fugitive president who only yesterday warned that protests will be crushed, dissidents will be punished. Today, from that very balcony, those same dissidents threw Ceausescu's books into the street. They cheered for a new, free Romania.
5 weeks ago, Ceausescu was reappointed to another term as General Secretary of Romania's Communist Party. In effect, he reappointed himself. Today, mourners visited mass graves in the city of Timisoara, where 5 days ago the killings in Ceausescu's name began. In effect, one man and his family would apparently do anything to save itself. There has rarely been such an obvious cult of personality. He likes to be referred to as the genius of the Carpathians, as if he towered like the Carpathian Mountains. He also likes Conducator, which is roughly equivalent to Führer, which is what Adolf Hitler was called during the darkest days of Germany. Ceausescu and his family extended their reach to every facet of Romanian life. Ceausescu, his wife Elena, their 40-year-old son Nicu, and various relatives have held all the important party and government posts. The secret police have terrified people for years. Dissidents have been exiled or simply killed. The crude use of force to suppress every attempt at freedom.
There is proof tonight that one of the most brutal dictators in the world is dead. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena were executed by the new government of Romania after a 2-hour trial that found them guilty of, quote, genocide and other grave crimes.
They were shouting, "Show us the bodies," in Bucharest Central Square this morning, demanding proof from the new government that Nicolae Ceausescu was finally and truly dead. 2 hours later, Romanian television gave them this proof: roughly edited pictures of Ceausescu and his wife in captivity, and then Ceausescu after the firing squad. But whatever satisfaction his death gives Romanians, and that appears to be plenty, it means they are now left with no one they can all hate together. The new government is self-proclaimed, mostly intellectuals and politicians who suffered under Ceausescu. Ion Iliescu is the new president, a much admired man who once lost his job as a Communist Party secretary for criticizing Ceausescu. But few of the new faces have a real following among the people. Their lack of experience and Romania's lack of any real tradition of democracy in its long history worries Romanians. But right now, only the army stands in the way of anarchy. The civil war of the last few days is not quite over. Soldiers are still searching out members of Ceausescu's secret police who tried to turn back the people's revolution with gunfire. Today was quieter than yesterday. People are beginning to clean up this battered city, but they are angry rather than joyous. For a nation trying to feel its way toward democracy, there could have been better ways to start.
They say you can't capture the image of freedom on videotape, but you can, you know. In fact, of all the images in the 1980s, surely the most vivid are those associated with freedom. In Eastern Europe, which the Soviets had held by force since World War II, Mikhail Gorbachev said that Moscow would no longer interfere, and the people felt free to act. Poland's solidarity was never dead, only in hibernation. Today, the independent union movement leads a government with a non-communist majority. Solidarity's time had come after all. In Hungary, where Soviet tanks had broken the last revolution in the 1950s, the revolution of the 80s was gradual. But the Communist Party was forced to apologize for the Soviet crackdown in the 50s, and the party was forced by the people to call free elections. And when Hungary began to roll up the Iron Curtain, tens of thousands of East Germans saw it on West German television. The word spread in no time.
Wunderbar, super, ganz super.
First, they headed for those openings in the fence between Hungary and Austria.
Let's go!
And then they headed for the West German embassy in next-door Czechoslovakia. The pressure of East Germans fleeing in such numbers forced the East German government to make one concession after another. The country was hemorrhaging. The pressure was too much. The communist leadership buckled. Travel restrictions, it said, would be lifted. It was a momentous declaration. And that very night, for the first time since 1961, they made a hole in the Berlin Wall. It had not seemed possible only months ago.
Happy.
Now anything seemed possible. Romania. In the last days of the decade, even the hardline leadership of Nicolae Ceausescu, who had gunned down his own people to stay in power, finally folded. Czechoslovakia, with one of the toughest leaderships in the Soviet sphere. And the Communist Party was brought down in less than a month. At the end of the 1980s, so many walls were coming down. It was a magnificent decade for democracy.
Inside the Soviet Union, the ferment continues. The economy has become a disaster. And the republics, artificially forged by force into the Soviet Union, grow increasingly restive. Ethnic divisions in those republics, long suppressed by Soviet forces, are now very much apparent. Inside Mr. Gorbachev's Soviet Union, pressure builds for massive restructuring, multi-party government, a federated state, for a consumer economy that works, for consumer products that satisfy a people who now believe they have gone far too long with far too little. Today in the Soviet Union, there are 350 to 500 billion rubles, which the public strictly cannot spend. How Mr. Gorbachev copes with all of this is very much part of the story of the fall of communism. The forces that have been loosed in the name of glasnost and perestroika pose the question: will the birthplace of world communism itself ultimately be non-communist? And if so, what then?
Lord Carrington, a very simple question to start off with. Is communism really and truly dead?
Well, Russian communism is really and truly dead, I would have thought, because it quite clearly doesn't work. Whether communism in a different form will re-emerge and whether China will go on as a communist is another matter.
Communism is not dead in a sense, but it's moribund. And communism as a theory has been shredded. Someone once said there's nothing so sad as seeing a beautiful theory mugged by a gang of facts. Well, if any theory has ever been mugged by facts, the theories behind the communist approach to social management and social organization have been mugged. Man is not purely economic. He is driven by aspirations for freedom, for dignity, for self-determination, for self-expression, and a whole variety of other things.
Communism as we've known it, communism that has anything to do with the combination of Marx and Lenin, that's dead.
One thing that Americans often tend to forget is that nationalists and the opponents of autocrats or dictators are not themselves necessarily Democrats. And the revulsion against communist rule is liable to spawn a great many political movements, reactivate a number of quarrels that had been kept below the surface for a very long time, such as the Romanians going after the Hungarians in their midst, such as in the Soviet Union, the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis having at each other. And so there is certainly no guarantee that an absence of one form of totalitarian rule is necessarily going to bring democracy in or anything like that in its wake. It also does not necessarily mean that economic prosperity is just going to be just around the corner.
There's nothing automatic about democracy. Democracy is difficult to build. It often is the outcome of not only decades, but even in some cases of centuries of effort. It requires a number of critical ingredients, not just the writing of a constitution and the invention of certain institutions like a legislative branch and free elections, but indeed a spirit of tolerance, a recognition that a loyal opposition, a civilized opposition is a necessary and good thing within the process, and a lot of experience with representative government. Eastern Europe has very little of that, with the exception of Czechoslovakia. They've got a lot of problems. They've got a lot of traditions which go in the other direction, which are basically authoritarian. So the process of getting from the Soviet-style political and economic system in Eastern Europe to democracy is going to be very difficult.
Well, we must try and help them to become democracies. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that that will necessarily happen. I mean, one of the things that experience shows that when a country is liberated, I mean, whether it's liberated from communism or colonialism or fascism or whatever you like, expectations are raised among the general public of that country that the millennium is around the corner. And in the circumstances of today and the economic situation in most of those East European countries, the millennium is a very long way off, and disillusion may set in.
Which forces do you see driving the Soviet Union now?
At the moment, the problem which is at the core of everything is the economic mess. This is a society that is sinking into a deep economic crisis. I said at the outset that what motivated Gorbachev was a sense that the system was not performing well enough, that its performance was a steady downhill decline. But it was essentially what might be called a pre-crisis. He was saying unless we make a certain number of changes within the Soviet Union in the 1990s or at some point in the future, we will be in a deep crisis. The truth of the matter is he set out to deal with the problems. He's created a deep crisis. They are in the midst of a very real crisis, not just political, but above all else economic. So the single most important problem right now is the impact of an economic crisis for which he apparently has no good answers. And that in turn affects, indeed that in turn infects all these other problems, the nationality conflicts, the political restlessness of the population, consumer dissatisfaction, which then leads to worker dissatisfaction, coal miner strikes, a lot of these other things. So much of it is interwoven with the economic problem.
The Soviets are desperate for technology. In their military technology, their space technology is absolutely first rate. But their civilian technology, I mean, in the sense of having water that is safe to drink as it comes out of the tap, which it isn't in Leningrad at all, and to a large extent isn't in Moscow. Technology in the sense of you turn on a light switch, does a light come on? Well, frequently in the Soviet Union, no. Or if it does come on, it becomes very dim. Technology in the sense if you pick up a telephone and dial it, are you going to get anything other than static? Well, in the Soviet Union, you frequently aren't. Technology in the sense of if you get on an airplane, you know, is it going to be a reasonably comfortable plane that's going to get there? Well, in the Soviet Union, it may well get there, might not. But it certainly isn't going to be comfortable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to go down and buy an automobile? Ha! You got 3 or 4 years to wait, and when you do, it'll probably break down after the first 200 or 300 miles. I'm overdrawing the case, but the economics of the Soviet Union are disastrous. The technology situation in the civilian sector is disastrous, and the Soviets are trying very hard to repair that. That's one of the reasons that Gorbachev is pushing his policy of openness and everything, but they're repairing it by lots of means, and one of them is that the KGB may be trying to project a friendlier, kindlier, gentler image but there's been no diminution in its level of effort. Its priorities have shifted a little bit, and it's now not going after purely military secrets, but it's going with throttle wide open after Western, particularly U.S. technology, on the theory that such technology is a lot cheaper to steal than it is to develop.
Well, what is driving Mr. Gorbachev, I think, is the realization that you can't remain a superpower if you're bankrupt. And it's quite clear that the Soviet Union over the years has fallen further and further behind in terms of competitiveness and technology, and that there is no way that they can keep up with the United States unless they do something about their economy, or indeed with the Western Europe or Japan. And just having the possession of nuclear weapons is not enough. You've got to have a reasonable economy, and I'm sure this is what's behind what Mr. Gorbachev is doing.
The truth of the matter is that for the last 10 years, the Soviet Union has been a superpower only in terms of its military power. It has not been a power of consequence in most of the arenas that matter, many of them economic. There, Japan is a far more important country, and potentially Western Europe, and within it a reunified Germany. Indeed, I think at this stage, a very important historic process is underway. The Soviet Union, in the context of these many crises, all of which in the end focus on the economic crisis, is in the process of being reduced from a superpower to a middle power. In the future, one of the difficulties for the United States is to figure out how we relate to this country, which we've always thought of as a superpower, we've used as a mark by which we orient ourselves in the outside world, when it's no longer that, when it is simply another of the major powers in international politics.
What do you think you might be seeing in terms of a Soviet Union in the 21st century? Is it going to be profoundly different than the one we're looking at today?
Yes, I think so. I think that there is a real possibility of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And certainly if things go along the same sort of path that they're going at the moment, I don't believe that you can now shoot people, or at least it's very unlikely that the Soviet would decide they could shoot people in order to keep them in the Soviet Union. And I think you see all the beginnings of problems in all the other Soviet republics, and whether or not the Soviet Union will hold together, I don't know, but there's a real possibility it won't, and you'd be left with Russia. And of course then the great problem would be, what about the Ukraine? Because could Russia do without the Ukraine? And yet you already see in the Ukraine signs of a nationalist movement advised by Solidarity.
One scenario is that Gorbachev, or some successor very much like him, will still be in the saddle. The Communist Party will be slightly diminished, but will still have basic control over the society. There will have been a few alarms and excursions in the Baltic states, and a little ruffle in the Caucasus and things like that, but things won't be radically different. Another scenario is that civil war will have broken out in Russia, and that various portions of the Russian Empire will be contending for autonomy or independence, and the whole thing will get out of hand and will raise the grave specter of whoever is in authority in Russia trying to conjure up some foreign foe to give them an excuse to divert people's attentions away from stresses and strains at home.
Now we're in a situation in which we don't really know where we are, because you know, if 6 months ago you'd said to me that what has happened was going to happen, I would have told you to go to a psychiatrist. And here we are now in a totally different situation. But having said that, I'd much rather be in this situation than the other one, because we have got an opportunity now of doing something which will make us, or enable us to live, if we're sensible, in a world which is much safer and at a very much lower level of expense.
We have an obvious stake in seeing the Soviet Union move toward a more open order, and probably one with functioning markets, because there's presumably a contradiction between a democratic order and a centrally planned economy or an administered economy, and we want that to occur without great violence, without great civil unrest, certainly without civil war within the society or conflicts among peoples, and there are many different peoples in the Soviet Union. But in addition, we also want the Soviet Union, since it is a great power, to continue to play a constructive role on the outside. We want the Soviet Union to share the burden of helping Eastern Europe to make its transition. We don't want the Soviet Union to abandon Eastern Europe. We want the Soviet Union to continue to play a constructive role in international politics, in pursuing peacekeeping, in regional conflicts and the like. We don't want the Soviet Union to turn its back on the outside world in a kind of sulking angry, bitter preoccupation with its internal difficulties.
What I think probably you will find is that there is a good deal of unease in the Soviet Union, not just in military circles, about their own security policy, because in the last few months they've seen the whole of the security policy devised since 1944 in Yalta crumble round their ears. I mean, the buffer states of Eastern Europe have disappeared. The Warsaw Pact is no longer credible. And with the paranoia that the Russians have about invasion, there must be some disquiet in the Soviet Union about their security position, which is something that we ought to take account of, because we can't buy our own, at least I don't think that we can buy our own security at the expense of the insecurity of the Soviet Union. So we've got to find means of dealing with that.
Are they right? The passage of time will answer that question. But there is one more question, and it has a very surprising answer. Ask almost anyone who caused the fall of Western communism and what produced the stunning collapse of the Soviet European monolith. And almost invariably, the answer will be Mikhail Gorbachev and his policies of glasnost and perestroika. Well, there's no doubt Gorbachev played an important role, but he is not the man who first triggered the changes. They were, in fact, triggered long before he took power. They were loose the day Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyła became Pope. Soon after assuming his new post, he announced he would visit his homeland. The Polish government said he could come, but they would not prepare his visit. They turned that responsibility over to the Polish Catholic Church. The Church created an important infrastructure throughout the country to deal with what turned out to be a phenomenal tour of Poland. Months later, the outbreak took place at the Gdansk shipyard, and a new leader emerged, Lech Walesa, proclaiming the founding of a free trade union, Solidarity. Within a month, that union had 9 million members. How did it happen so quickly? Very simply, the Catholic Church infrastructure had become Solidarity. And even though Solidarity was later suppressed for years, its image swept through the Eastern Bloc, fueling the desire for liberty. So it was an accident. Had the Vatican elected a different pope? Or had Leonid Brezhnev elected a different course of action once John Paul II announced his intention to visit Poland? Or if Brezhnev had not decided to elevate a young Soviet politician named Gorbachev to the Politburo, much or perhaps all of the change we have seen in the past year might never have happened. But it did. And it produced the fall of communism. The story is not over. The Soviet Union and the East Bloc countries are all fighting to accommodate to a new life and attempting to create a new economy. With success, we will see the emergence of the democracy we respect. With failure, anything can happen. The story continues. I'm Pierre Salinger. Thank you.
To learn more, we suggest the following books: Russia, The Roots of Confrontation by Robert Daniels, Russia and the West, Gorbachev and the Politics of Reform by Jerry Hoff, and The Soviet Union Today, edited by James Craycraft. This has been The Fall of Communism. This has been a special production of ABC News.